Welcome back to Sika Strength and welcome back to the Sika Stand Technique Sunday series. Today we're doing Ruslan Albegov Snatch. Ruslan is a Russian super heavyweight and he snatched at least 215 kilos in training that looks like this, and it is excellent. Now Ruslan is probably one of the best technical models of any super, damn it, even any lifter in this current kind of generation or probably the previous generation of lifters. And in this series we focus on two different aspects per lifter that you can improve upon and then some ways you can implement in your training. And the first place I want to start with today is something we haven't touched on yet, and that is the dynamic start. Now the dynamic start in weightlifting is something that's incredibly valuable. What is a dynamic start? Well, essentially a dynamic start is something that makes use of something known as a stretch shortening cycle. You've probably heard of the stretch shortening cycle before. Maybe it's here in this channel or in other places, but the stretch shortening cycle is something that essentially makes you more powerful. It helps you produce more force, and in our case in weightlifting, more force at a faster rate, which is, as you know, incredibly important. Now the stretch shortening cycle is a combination of multiple different physiological phenomena, such as a pre-stretched muscle produces more force, the elastic nature of specific parts of that muscle come into play, this kind of viscoelastic nature. We've got the primary one, which is probably the viscoelastic nature of tendons. So when we pull these tendons, we stretch them, they snap back at a greater rate than we would see just the muscles moving back by themselves. Then we've got stuff like the kind of central nervous system activity going on, similar to this kind of idea that an object in motion is going to be able to keep moving compared to one that's at a static position. Then there's stuff like muscle texosophy, which is kind of related to that a muscle that's already just moves is freer to keep moving. So there's a lot of physiological phenomena involved. You don't particularly need to worry about those. All you need to know that a dynamic start is incredibly useful for you in weightlifting. Now, not everyone has to use one, but what it does allow us to do is potentially allow more force into that barbell at a faster rate. So what is a dynamic start? Well, it's essentially a lifter who more often than not lifts their hips up above where they will start pulling the barbell. So typically we'll see, or what we'll look for, is a hamstring around parallel, depending on the lifter, maybe a little bit higher, or depending on the lifter, maybe a little bit lower. Typically what a 1 or 2 hip pump is known is a lifter will lift their hips up and then swing them down into that start position and almost immediately begin the lift. Now this makes use of that pre-stretched muscles and allows us to use that stretch shortening cycle to great effect. Now there is some problems associated with a dynamic start, but there's a lot of benefits to it. And ultimately, we are a speed strength sport. If we watch Ruslan here, he makes great use of that dynamic start in a very typical Russian style. He lifts his hips up high, swings down into that start position, and then almost immediately, in some cases, begins pulling the barbell. Ruslan makes excellent use of the dynamic start, and he really makes use of this when he's pulling those heavier weights. Typically what we'd see in a static start is a lifter will set up, they'll extend their chest, they'll remain almost motionless or essentially motionless. There'll be very little net joint movement from that lifter. Typically we'll see Chinese lifters will make a little bit more use of a static start, although very rarely do we see anyone truly static before they begin pulling. Everyone has a little bit of twitching or muscle twitching, but for the sake of definition, there's a very clear distinction between what Ruslan would do versus what Tian Tao would do, for example. So a static start allows more force. We talked about a faster barbell, which is really important in weightlifting because, again, it's a speed strength sport, so the speed and the strength portions are covered by the dynamic start. Now, there's obviously a lot of benefits to dynamic starting, so a faster barbell is very useful, but a very common issue with the dynamic start is inconsistency in technique, and it takes quite literally tens of thousands of repetition, years to practice, years of the fundamentals being correct that largely play into how well you can use that dynamic start. And there's no reason you can't spend a lot of time doing a static start initially, which is how we would teach the lifts, and then you get used to using the dynamic start because it's faster, it's psychologically more pressure. You're coming up to the barbell, instead of having time to coordinate yourself and think about your positions, the static start gives you an opportunity just to sit there, think about it, whereas the dynamic start makes you do it a lot faster. Now ideally a well-trained lifter will have these lifts done as second nature. It'll be almost fully autonomous. Even a great lifter like Gabriel Sincrean, uses what I would consider a static start. We do see him pull his chest back into that position, but he's not really getting a lot of large joint movements. He's not pre-stretching his hamstrings or anything similar like that, or his glutes. He is, tightening his back. He drops his hips a little bit, but that's a fine line between a dynamic start compared to something like Ruslan, for example. So you'll see Ruslan will set up, he stretches up his hips, and then he swings them down into the barbell and makes use of the stretch shortening cycle. Now, finding your dynamic start is actually something that will come reasonably naturally to you. For the most part, I just want you to practice a single hip pump like Ruslan does, which is hips high, drops them down. Now, Ruslan has a lower hip position or hamstring position than you would normally be using. Ideally, what I want is for you to have your hamstring around parallel or maybe a little bit above parallel, as we've talked about before, when you're looking at your shoulder position, the barbell, and how they move as the barbell leaves the floor. So there's no point you using a dynamic start. There's no point you using more force into that barbell off the floor, is if your positions immediately go to shit and you have much worse quality technique. So any benefits you got from that extra force production or power production are quickly lost by inefficiencies in an inconsistent technique or a technical model that's not the one you actually want to be following. So the use of a dynamic start is with the caveat that you are able to be technically consistent. And if we look at Ruslan's lifts, we will see that he is outrageously consistent all the way from 160 to 215 kilos. And this pays dividends, for his ability to lift 215 kilos like that is technical consistency, and technical consistency in dynamic start is excellent. Now, the second area I want you to focus in on Ruslan's technique is his sweep in the second pull, but more specifically, what I want you to focus on is his hip position during the second pull. Ruslan is incredibly patient with his hips in the second pull, and if I have to say, possibly one of the most common mistakes in the snatch after bending your arms in the amateur lifter is too early with the hips. We want the net hip movement in the horizontal plane to be essentially as small as possible. Now, very, very common, we'll see as lifters will start to bring their hips in as soon as the barbell passes their knee. This provides a couple of issues. One, it puts us off balance. This follows on then that we can't apply as much force in the vertical direction. So we're a little bit weaker, we're not as powerful. Generally, then we end up knocking the barbell forward because we're off balance. We see a bigger swing of the barbell, so we might miss the barbell behind, or we'll underpull the barbell because of lack of force, and we simply won't be able to complete any meaningfully heavy lifts. What's really common is that lifters will just bring those hips forward and we'll get that lower quality lift. When we think about this, what I like to phrase this in our head, or if we're thinking about this practically as a lifter, as soon as the hips start moving forwards, that's the end of the second pull, because as soon as you begin extending the hips, you've come into that third pull, you've come into the extension phase, and the hips coming forward means we've finished our second pull. But we want our second pull to last as long as possible because we want this to come back over the base of our support. The farther backwards the barbell travels, essentially over the base of our foot, the more powerful we're going to be, the more stable and balanced we're going to be, and the better we're able to keep the barbell close to our center of mass, and the better we'll be able to apply a vertical force to that barbell. See, in Ruslan's case, super short distance from his hips moving from the flexed position into that extended position, or the flexed position into the flat foot position at his contact point. You'll see it's a really short distance. However, it's not slow. So he's super aggressive in this short distance. Now, obviously, because we're moving those hips through a shorter distance, it's one of the reasons we need to be super aggressive and powerful in that third pull extension. So as we're extending there, you'll see he is no slouch. He's not slacking with the barbell. This comes back again to that first point, that when we're using that dynamic start, this allows that barbell to be traveling faster through that first and second pull. We know we need a faster second pull compared to our first pull. We know that the barbell slows down at contact point for everyone, and then we need to overcome this contact point by applying a faster barbell. We know we need a greater launch velocity, so we know we need to be aggressive, but applying that force in the right place is really important. There's no point you applying maximum force and speed from your hips and your legs and your upper body if you're so far out in your toes that you simply can't express the force into the barbell in a meaningful direction. So this second pull of that barbell coming back towards you is incredibly important. And we can often have a lifter who will have a very good dynamic start, a very good first pull, and passage across the knee, but then they'll just leave this barbell hanging out in front of them and won't be able to apply that force into that barbell correctly. So now we need to look at, how do I apply this in my training, and what can we learn from Ruslan that we might be able to correct for this? So when it comes to the dynamic start generally is something that is independent of your weight or your size or your anatomy or your strength levels in terms of pulling, in terms of squatting. You could make a case for either one of these. You can make a case for someone who's got very strong legs, can make use of a static start. But you could also make a case for someone being very, very strong and powerful with their legs, could also use a dynamic start really well. So it's not really the deciding factor. It largely comes down to, what have you practiced? What are you comfortable with psychologically? What are you comfortable with physiologically? What feels the best? But more importantly, what gives you the best results? What produces the best results in the lift? For example, there's no point you using a dynamic start if you hit that first pull really well, it's fast, but then by the time you get to the hips, you've got no speed left. You're in a terrible position and it's a waste of time. So the dynamic start is something that needs to be practiced. It's not just that, oh, I can do this to apply more power. It's, does this finesse my technique further? Does this allow me to exploit my attributes, my positive, my strengths better than if I used a static start? We know the Russians are very big fans of the dynamic starts. Soviets, if you come back a little bit further in years, have done a lot of investigations on the dynamic start, the force output through force plates, and what you would have seen, and they investigated different levels of dynamic starts, what kind of hip pump, a single hip pump, how low did you drop your hips, and they looked at this quite rigorously. They of course found that greater force output was coming from the dynamic start, but again, it can't be at the expense of good technique. So when it comes to the dynamic start, what we can learn from Ruslan's training is this kind of Russian idea of technical perfection. The Russians don't love excess squatting strength. They don't love massive deadlifts, or the typical model. I know we're looking at Klokov there, but Klokov essentially coached himself. And if we look at the traditional Russian modeling and come back to Soviet, they believed enough was enough. Now, whether I agree with that isn't really necessarily the point here when we're looking at what we learned from Ruslan's training. But what is interesting is this deliberate, intelligent practice. And I'm sure Ruslan practiced different kinds of dynamic start and static start, and he probably even learned with a static start. But he would have spent literally decades practicing this dynamic start with consistency. So what I would say to you is, if you're picking a dynamic start, pick one and stick with it, and don't change it too much. It takes a very long time for these sequences to become habits for you, for these sequences to become the most optimal. If you're changing your static start or your dynamic start all the time, you can very often end with suboptimal positions because they're not super fluid, they're not well ingrained. Think of these like a track through the woods. The more you walk through them, the finer you make the path, the clearer this path is made. The more people that walk through it, the clearer the path is and the easier it is for you to go through it. And it's the same with technical skills like the dynamic start. Is practice, but the same path. If you imagine you take 2-3 different paths every time you walk through the woods, none of these are going to be very clear. But if you've walked one path 10,000 days in a row, that path is going to be very well worn. So for you in dynamic start, you want to bring this Russian surgical precision from technical model, always improving each session, always trying to fine tune it and make sure it's perfect. And when it comes to his training in regards to the second pull and the ability to keep those hips back, we can look at back strength here being one of the prime drivers. Now we see the Russians are a big fan of pulls, they're a big fan of block work, and they're a big fan of assistance exercises in the form of back and abs, and that's with good reason. We don't often see videos of lifters doing their snatch pulls or assistance or exercises because it's not really sexy. It's not something we're going to see a whole lot in people's training. You're not going to put up those clips because most people don't particularly care, but we know that the Russians do enjoy their pulls. We do know that they enjoy those technically perfect pulls. We also know that they don't particularly love going very, very heavy with pulls, which is something I agree with to a large extent. I think the biggest thing when you're doing pulls or variations that mimic the pulls is technical perfection. I think you should go as heavy as technical perfection allows. I'm not massively worried about barbell speed when we're doing pulls. Look, we don't want every single session to be as heavy as possible. But if you're snatching 100 kilos and you can get to 120 kilos for snatch grip deadlifts that are very, very, very reminiscent of your snatch, and they replicate those joint angles the same, there is some benefits, especially as an unenhanced amateur lifter. You will benefit from that strength. That is a benefit to you. Whereas if you're an enhanced lifter and you can snatch 215 kilos, we don't really need you to do 230 kilo snatch pulls. Would they be useful? Maybe in certain circumstances. And we do see the Soviets or the Russians overloading pulls at times. But there is uses to it for you. So if we can replicate those snatch grip positions or the snatch positions in your pulls, your deadlifts, there is a benefit to going heavier than 100% of your lifting. Then we have variations like that stiff-legged deadlift. And then we've also stuff like back extensions are incredibly useful here. There used to be a saying in weightlifting that biceps are to bodybuilders what backs are to weightlifters. We've seen Liu Xiaojun's back, and he's one of the best snatchers ever, and that's with good reason. He has very strong legs, no doubt about it, but he also has an exceptionally strong back. Now, I'll give you a bit of a help here, or a bit of solace. My back isn't as strong as it should be. It's something I've probably neglected over my career of weightlifting, certainly in lieu of snatching, or certainly in lieu of squatting, which, it benefited me, of course, but I'm working very, very hard at my back strength now, and it's something that's incredibly important. You should almost be as diligent with your back strength as you should be your squatting strength. Now, squatting strength will help your pulling strength a lot, whereas the opposite doesn't always go the same way, but you should be thinking about your snatch pulls like you're thinking about your back squat sets. You probably need a stronger squat for sure, but also think about what's your clean deadlifts. What's your snatch grip deadlift like? What's your clean grip deadlift like? And are they sufficient? Can you do Romanian deadlifts with 100% of your snatch with clean grip or with a snatch grip? And then the answer, if it's resoundingly no, it might be worth looking at. If you have a problem where your hips come into the barbell too early, if you pull your shoulders back behind the barbell too early, it might be that your back strength is one lacking here. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. Hope you enjoyed the footage of Ruslan. I always love Ruslan. Great lifter. Seen him snatch 210 in competition a few times. I haven't seen him, but on video. And a 215 kilo snatch, with that technique, you couldn't help but do him on today's video. If anyone you'd like to see, do please let me know. I hope you're enjoying today's series and today's episode.